Hi, I'm Richard, the founder of 10 Adventures, and this is the 10 Adventures podcast. Each week we talk to real people about real adventures as they explore this incredible planet we all live on. Welcome to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we have a really interesting guest. It's a Brit who cycled across Canada, and Canada is a big country. Driving across it is a serious undertaking. So to hear from someone who's actually cycled across this country is really exciting. And with me today is Karen and Victoria. Hi, Karen. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Excited to hear about this cycle trip.
And Chris, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing out in the UK?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's great having you here. So before we start this, are you some sort of superhuman cyclist, or are you just like a regular person that likes to get on the bike, and this seemed like an interesting trip to do?
Definitely a regular person who just likes to get on their bike. Yeah. So this was the longest trip that I'd done beforehand, and I've not done anything the same length since. So, yeah. Have you done other kind of long distance cycling trips? I've done some that were about 700 or 800 miles. So I rode from Leeds in the UK across to Berlin in Germany through the Netherlands. That was just upwards of 600 miles. And then me and another friend cycled from Toronto to Quebec City as a separate trip. And I forget how long that was exactly, but those two are the longest before this.
So what made you want to do this trip, cycling across Canada? That's a big undertaking.
I lived in Toronto for 3 months in 2009, studying. And that sort of planted the seed for being interested in Canada. And I didn't have enough time to go to the rural places. All I had time was to live in the city. We had a one-day trip out to Algonquin, and there was just this seed of all this extra stuff to see. So then my friend who lived there with me, in 2013, we went back and cycled from Toronto to Quebec, like I just mentioned. And that was sort of testing the waters. So we'd spoken about cycling coast to coast one day, but thought it was too big to be realistic. But then on this ride, we saw sort of how easy and inviting it is to cycle there, and decided to just water the seed and plan the long ride.
So how did you plan that route?
So the first thing we did was looked at the cities on the west and east and see which ones have international airports, basically, and figure out our bookends. And we settled on Vancouver on the west and St. John's on the east. And then we sort of looked at existing routes that people had done before on websites like Ride with GPS or Bike Road Toaster. So people have saved the routes they've done, and we gathered a few of those, looked at them, looked where they sort of went, read forums, figured out what people recommended, and then cross-referenced all that with the places we really wanted to see, which were fairly few and far between, mainly just the big cities where we had friends scattered about. And then we just tried to string a route that went to all of those places and would let us do it in the right amount of time, basically.
Which end did you start at?
We started in Vancouver in June 2017. And then we headed east across to St. John's, and we got there in September.
How far did you go then, total?
So total distance was just over 4,500 miles. I can't do that calculation to kilometres off the top of my head, but
not to worry. And what was the ride like?
Yeah, it's really good. That's quite a difficult question to answer sort of concisely, but the overarching memory was like a summer that was excellent all the way across. We didn't have any problems with sort of gear or unexpected problems or anything like that. Everyone we met was lovely. Pretty much everywhere we cycled was beautiful. As I said earlier, it's a really inviting country to cycle in. There's a lot of, even though there's not sort of dedicated bike track everywhere, there's a lot of attention and care given to cyclists compared to some of the places we've ridden. People were super curious everywhere we went. Every time we stopped at the side of the road or outside a shop, someone would come over to us and sort of ask what we were doing, ask what we were up to, tell us some local gossip or information, or tell us about a trip they'd been on in the past. So it was this real, I just remember loads of stories and loads of connections with people who we probably would never have met or spoken to otherwise.
there's lots of different ways to get across Canada, and I've heard horror stories of people going across central Canada. Just, you're on a narrow highway with semis bearing down beside you, and it can be pretty stressful. For the route you chose, did you have lots of situations like that, or were you able to find roads with a good shoulder where it wasn't just kind of gripping your handlebars in fear?
Speaking to people who've done the ride or are planning the ride, this is one of the main things that comes up. Like, people are terrified of the traffic, which is understandable, because there were some stretches where the only real route you can take, or the only real route we found at least, was the Trans-Canada Highway. So the section that comes to mind is the north coast of Lake Superior. And that's just like highway for days, basically. And there are big trucks. And the shoulder is big enough for your bike, but not big enough to feel fully secure when a truck goes roaring past. But I think there's a lot of familiarity with busy roads, and a lot of the A roads in the UK are a lot more intense to cycle on than the busiest Canadian highways. So for me, going to that setting wasn't too stressful, but I know that there's sections that definitely put some people off.
And then starting with the mountains first, was that like, how was that for your legs? Just, you get out of Vancouver and, within 100 clicks, you're going up and going up and going up. How was that? Was that a real shock to the system, or were you prepared for big elevation gains?
I was sort of prepared, but more sort of, there was a lot of lingering dread. So I didn't do anywhere near enough training before I came out. I lost my bike in the sort of January before the ride, and I had to get a new one in March. So that gave me 3 months to train. And in that time, I only really did 2 or 3 rides in the Peak District here, which is quite hilly, but nowhere near what you're going to find in the Rockies, really. I knew that it was going to be intense, but I also knew that I'd done similar climbs in the past, so without gear on my bike. So I was just sort of hoping that the combination of experience and all that would make it manageable. And there was also the knowledge that in the first 15% of the miles of the ride, we were going to chip off over 50% of the elevation. So even though there was dread about the hills coming up, there was all this like really motivating number in our heads, knowing that we wouldn't have many hills for the rest of the way across, relatively. But and also I literally expected to leave Vancouver and then be going up the hills the next day. But obviously you've got this big stretch of like valleys and places like Lake Okanagan and places like that, where it was just this relatively smooth riding that was unexpected. So that was a nice little introduction to get used to the gear on our bikes, get used to the riding big distances a day before we got to the mountains. And then when we actually got there, the elevations were much more manageable than I expected. So in the UK, if you go into the countryside and ride over a hill, it's likely that it used to just be a sort of farm track that goes literally over the hill, and then they tarmacked it. So you're tackling elevations that are up to like 15, 16, maybe even 20%. But in the Rockies, I think the highest elevation gradient was about 7 or 8%. So you're climbing for a long time in the sun, but it's never too steep to make it particularly unpleasant.
Actually, I've heard some people say that with bike touring, you don't have to worry too much about training because you'll be training your first few days on the bike anyway. So with that in mind, does the biking uphill ever get easier?
Yeah, definitely. That's what I told my friends and family actually before I came out. They were all asking like whether we were going to be able to do it with the training we'd done. And I said that the first month would be the training for the other 2. And it definitely feels like that. You feel your strength increasing day by day. You feel like this on the first day, there's this massive weight underneath you and you can't steer your bike properly because it all feels weird. But then a week in, that's easy. And then you definitely notice this on hills as well. So we did the Rockies, got them out of the way. And then on the other side, we had the Cabot Trail, which is, that to me feels more like cycling sort of British hills where the gradients are quite unforgiving in places. And by that point, I was completely in the mindset of just slowing down, getting into the lowest gear, taking the hill as slowly as I needed to. And I remember there was one hill that we went up at about 3.5 miles an hour, which is barely quicker than walking pace. And it took about an hour and a half to get to the top maybe. But it was just like this shift in mindset from seeing hills as something to be daunted and intimidated by to seeing it as something to slip into and relax and appreciate and just enjoy the place, a new rhythm.
That's interesting how you talked about the change in your mindset, because I think that is something that happens when you're doing a long tour. And can you talk more about that change in mindset that you had?
Yeah, that's one of my favourite aspects of the ride, I think, both at the time and sort of looking back on it. Because you really feel like you're shifting into this new like rhythm, a new pace of life, and all the things that are on your mind when you're at home just gradually fall away. So there's no to-do lists to look at, there's no emails to look at, there's no work that needs to be done. You're setting your own schedule in terms of when you get up and go to sleep and stop and eat. So there's this incredible amount of flexibility and agency. And after a couple of weeks in the saddle, maybe, you just feel like you're in this different plane to where you were when you left. And it's really pleasurable, basically. And it happens physically as well. So you feel, like I said before, you feel yourself getting stronger and you feel yourself accomplishing things on a daily basis. So I kept track of the miles each night. So I'd get to camp and I'd get my handlebar GPS and add up the miles we'd done to the total. So there's just this ever increasing number that you've got behind you. And you know that you're getting closer and closer to your target. So it feels like it's almost set up to put you in like a good headspace with the achievements and the accomplishments and the goal, working towards a goal and all this stuff.
Yeah, I've done some long bike tours myself, and I've had that experience of the change in mindset. And I love that feeling as well. Like, it really makes life quite simple.
Yeah, absolutely.
With that in mind, what was a typical day or week like for you?
A typical day is hard to answer because they're also, even though it's quite a similar template, there's a lot of spontaneity and sort of randomness that happens. And obviously you're in different places constantly. But the basic template of a day would usually get up around 8:15. From Vancouver to Quebec, I rode with one friend, Christian. And then in Quebec City, our friend Alex joined us. So for the last 1,500 miles, there was three of us. And the rhythm, the template of the day shifted a little bit when Alex joined. But for the first part, we sort of got up around 8:15, 8:30, potted around a little bit, had a leisurely breakfast and left for about 9:30, 10. And then we'd just cycle until we felt tired, stop for lunch, cycle until we felt tired, stop for camp. So we didn't have campsites in mind in the morning particularly. We just sort of pushed on until we felt tired. So there was a lot of improvisation, I guess, in the average day. And then when we got to camp, we'd usually try and find like a beer store or an LCBO or whatever the provincial equivalent was. Usually end up disappointed because they all shut at some ridiculously early hour as soon as you get out into the rural places. Then just sort of set up camp, have our camp dinner, which was eggs and rice pretty much every night. And then we'd just sort of chat, read, go to bed not too long after sunset and get ready to do it again the next day.
I really liked it when I did the bike tour, that feeling of just seeing how the day went, seeing how you felt, seeing what the weather was like, and then deciding where you were going to stay and where you were going to set up camp. I think that freedom's a really nice feeling. What were the highlights of the ride for you?
I sort of alluded to it earlier, but I think all of the highlights I come back to frequently are things involving people that we hadn't, that we just met sort of randomly. And a lot of it sort of revolves around real spontaneous generosity and people going out of their way to be as nice as possible. And it was like being around that energy was just like a real treat. But there's a few, like one example, we were riding with these two guys from France called Victor and Joe, and we met them in Nipigon in Ontario. And then we rode a little bit of Lake Superior together, and then they sort of slowed down and we went ahead. And then a few days later we bumped into them again in, I forget the exact place, but it was near Manitoulin Islands, just like a bit west of that. And they told us that they'd met a couple at the side of the road who were just having a rest in a rest stop, and the couple were staying in their summer cabin on the lake nearby, and they'd invited these guys to go and stay with them for a night for like a barbecue and just to see the area. And then they said that we should tag along as well. So we rode for the rest of the day, got to this cabin with these people we hadn't met, who our friends had met and sort of invited us by proxy. And we planned to go there, have a beer with them, and then sort of say goodbyes and find our own place to camp. But they were completely insistent that we stay as well. And they told us to like set up our tent between. So there's 2 cabins, 2 families. And they said, set up the tent in between. And in the end, we stayed for 2 nights, and they put on this enormous sort of barbecue both nights. They took us out on their boat onto the islands, gave us a tour of like the local area, and they were just so insistent that we sort of spend time with them and swap stories. And it felt a bit like a currency. Like we'd tell them the stories that we'd collected on the ride so far, and they'd tell us stories about their life and the adventures they'd been on. So one of the women, Phyllis, had been to the North Pole on a research expedition a couple of years before, and she was telling us all about that. So it was just this, I guess this is one specific thing, but the thread that runs through the highlights was that sort of exchange of stories and the sort of hospitality and friendships that evolved around it with people you'd only met an hour before. It feels like you skip through these layers of social interaction that you'd usually be required to pass through to make friends with someone, just on the token of both being interested in this sort of lifestyle, I guess.
It's interesting you say that, because we were talking to a fellow who just cycled the length of India, and he said something similar just to what you're saying. But his words were something to the effect of having a bike when you're touring around a place is like magic. And he said the same thing, that people were always coming up to him and talking to him and, offering him things. And I had a bit of that experience. I cycled the coast of Oregon, and people were always coming up to talk to us. We didn't get gifts like you. Perhaps we weren't as entertaining, but lots of people would talk to us that I agree with you probably wouldn't have done so otherwise.
Yeah, I always wonder whether it is entertainment or whether it's some like mild pity or concern about us, like with this sort of scraggly gear and looking sort of tired and disheveled, and whether they're like, wow, these guys really need some help. Let's bring them in and feed them up. It's always hard to tell. But yeah, I think it definitely feels like magic. Like I said before, every time you stop anywhere, so gas station, restaurant, even at the side of the road, someone will look or wave from their car or come over and say hello. Or one time this couple pulled their RV over in the shoulder just ahead of us and waved us down. And we thought they were going to like tell us off cycling in the shoulder or tell us that we'd dropped something a while back. But they just opened up the cooler they had in the back, got out 2 beers, ice cold beers, and gave them to us. And this was at the top of some massive hill as well. And they were just like, have these beers, guys, have a rest. It was literally everywhere constantly. And it was, I really struggled to believe that it would happen if you were driving or on foot or anything. So yeah, I agree with that guy.
Yeah, there's something about going under your own speed that you can be slow enough to have these types of experiences. But a big part of doing a big journey under your own power is also there's times where you struggle, where it's really, really tough. And going across Canada, were there any times where it was just really tough for you that you remember?
Yeah, there's a couple. So the first was just after the Rockies, where I was expecting sort of plain sailing, easy ride on my legs for a little while. And then we hit the prairies, and all of the forums we'd read, all of the advice we'd heard was that the prevailing wind would be going from the west to east and would blow you along. So in the prairies, you'd be able to crank out like 150-mile days easily. And of course, when we got there, the wind was going in the other direction. So riding across this flat land was more difficult than riding on the rocky passes. So that was a bit of a drain, because I was in this mindset of being ready to have like a little flat bit, and it was harder work. But then the beauty of the prairies, and that was one of the places where people were most sort of forthcoming to talk to us, that quickly offset that, which was nice. And then the second time that stands out was just after Winnipeg. So we stayed with a family friend in Winnipeg, and their adopted Canadian family invited us to stay in their cabin on Lake Catastrophe, which is, I think, just past the Ontario border, north a little bit. And they offered to give us a lift there if we wanted to, but we said that in keeping with what we'd ridden so far, we'd ride there and meet them there. And it was just a 2-day ride one night in the middle. And we rode, so we were riding east from Winnipeg, and we camped in a town. And this park ranger told us that some of the bins you have, like the bear-proof bins, they've got this little hatch at the back. And he said, if you're ever in a place where you can't find trees to hang your stuff up to protect it from bears, open one of these hatches on the bottom of the bin, put your food and your gear, camping gear, cooking gear even, in there overnight. And even if a bear smells it, it won't be able to get it out, and you can just go get it in the morning. So we couldn't find any trees that night. And I thought this guy's advice was pretty sound, considering he worked for the sort of park service. So we put our stuff in. And then in the morning, we were like camped, tucked out of the way in the woods, or not the woods, like this sort of scrub. I heard a clonk and then an engine start and the engine drive off. And I woke up and got out of my tent and went to look at the bin, and the bin men had emptied the front, but also the back. So they'd taken my pannier with my stove, most of my food, my friend's jet boil, which was to boil up the water, and all this stuff. So that in itself was quite frustrating. And we spent the morning wandering, like calling around, seeing if we could find the dump that it had been taken to, or find the truck that it had been put in to see if we could get it back. But all of our inquiries were sort of politely but firmly telling us that no, it was gone for good, kind of thing. So we just carried on riding, and then figured we'd pick up replacement gear in the town closest to the lake we were staying at. But that town had no shop that was big enough to sell camping gear that we needed. And then after that, there was in my mind, it feels like maybe 200 or 300 miles, but it probably wasn't that long. But this long stretch before we got to the nearest town. So we had 2 or 3 days with we couldn't eat any hot food. And there were barely any general stores because it was just like quite a rural stretch. And for some reason, the 2 restaurants we saw on this road after that were closed as well. So we just had a day, like 2 or 3 days of eating very badly and not feeling energized enough. And also knowing that we were going to have to spend a few $100s to replace the stuff that we'd lost to get back to baseline. So that was frustrating, but also like it's the story that I can dine on most about on the trip. So yeah, paid off.
Coming to the end of the trip, what's going through your mind on the last day? How do you feel? Are you happy to get it over with? Are you sad? Is it relief? How does it feel to complete a mammoth journey like this?
On the ferry across to Newfoundland, we got the last ferry crossing of the season, and the whole time riding through the Maritimes, it felt like everything was winding down around us. So the weather was getting cooler. A lot of sort of stores were closing, campsites were closing or coming up to the end of the season. So it all felt like it was winding down. And then in the ferry lounge, it was this like sort of 70s decor, I guess. And it made me feel super nostalgic just knowing that we'd finished the mainland of Canada and we were crossing to do one last day in Newfoundland from Argentia to St. John's. And I just remember feeling basically nothing. Like I was expecting a huge wave of accomplishment getting to the other side. But when I got to that point, it felt like, because each day has its own accomplishment and then it just builds up and up and up as you're riding across, the actual arrival at the end wasn't that sort of, I don't know what the word is, much less spectacular than I expected. So we got to Cape Spear, which is the furthest east point, and we just sort of, like me and my friend Christian, who'd done it from Vancouver, and Alex, who'd done it from Quebec, and our friend George, who flew out to St. John's just to meet us there and ride the last sort of 12 miles. We all just sat on a viewing platform looking out at the Atlantic and had a beer each, and we just sort of sat quietly. And there was we've got a few photos, but there was no like celebration. There was no like champagne cork flying through the air or anything. So it felt really subdued. I guess is the answer to your question. Like subdued, but with a real cumulative accomplishment across the whole trip.
Sometimes people, after they've done a big trek or a big trip, there's a sense of remorse that comes up, that they've spent months doing this thing and now it's over, kind of what's next. Did you have that kind of feeling?
Yeah, when we got to Cape Spear and we were in St. John's, Christian flew home. Me and Alex and George stayed, and another friend flew out, and we had like a week driving around Newfoundland. And I just remember feeling completely off kilter for that segment of the trip, because the rhythm that we'd built and the sort of lifestyle that we'd slotted into had just immediately stopped. Like we weren't on our bikes anymore. We went camping every night. The days, there was a lot more to think about and put into the days, and it just all felt very different. And then flying home to the UK was, like, remorse is a good word for it. I've heard a lot of people describe like post-trip depression or similar sort of things, and I wouldn't go that far, but I definitely felt lower than usual when I got back, because it's just such a beautiful thing to be able to do. Like you say, you're living on your own terms for quite a long time. So I think it's just like reverse culture shock, I guess, going home when you've been away physically and in terms of headspace is a real shock to the system.
Chris, you mentioned it's such a beautiful thing to do about your journey, and this is what I found with everything, whether or not it's a 5-day backpacking trip, a 2-week bike tour, or 30 or 60-day through hike or something like that. What I've found is a lot of people, once they've done it once, they just can't wait to get back. Where some of them struggle just to ever kind of reintegrate and get a full-time job again, because they're just thinking, I got to go out next summer and do something similar. Have you had that feeling as well, that you want to make this a bigger part of your life? Yeah,
for sure. So I used to work in a sort of 9-to-5 office environment, and just a couple of years before this ride, I went self-employed instead, with the view to make sure there was always space for this sort of thing as and when I wanted to do it. And I've managed to keep that going until today. And I've not done a bike ride of this scale since, but my partner and I are planning a couple of trips around Europe once the lockdown hopefully starts to wind down a little bit. So yeah, definitely.
Now, when you look back on the trip across Canada, what are your favorite memories? It sounds like some of them are those interactions you had with people and their generosity.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. It's really hard to pinpoint favourites, because every time I'm asked that question, my mind goes to about 10 different places and then gets overwhelmed by the sort of barrage of memories and then sort of can't focus on any particular one. But So I remember arriving in Quebec City and being really pleasantly surprised that it wasn't just a bunch of busy highways to get into the city. There was like the route vert cycle path that takes you in a really pleasant route, and then you get on a ferry and cross into the old town. I remember really enjoying that. I remember one town whose name I can't remember. We found a sort of truck stop campsite at the side of the road and camped there. And down some steps there was a river with a little jetty, and we just sat on that jetty for hours, like chatting and chilling out. We went canoeing in Rabbit Blanket National Park on Lake Superior. That was really nice to have a day off the bikes on the canoes. There's like literally hundreds of highlights, and it's difficult to pinpoint them. But
sounds amazing. What surprised you most about the trip?
One of the things that surprised me most was how wary and how dangerous Canadians perceived roads to be. So we got told so many times that we were approaching the most dangerous section of road in Canada, and we'd like psych ourselves up for this really tumultuous, like busy highway filled with trucks, and then we'd ride for about 5 minutes, get to where they said it would be, and we were just on this like beautiful picturesque highway winding through the mountains with 1 or 2 cars every 10 minutes. And that happened multiple times, and we got warned about sort of drunk drivers. We got warned about trucks roaring close to you, and just this constant peril, basically, from like campsite wardens and a lot of Canadian people we spoke to that never materialised. So that was one thing that shocked me for sure. It's funny you mentioned that. I know Alistair Humphreys, in his books about riding around the world, he'd say like almost every little village, they tell them how just after the village, it was either like lawless or bad people. It was just funny how it was always right near them was like the worst part of whatever country he was in. And I guess Canada's just like everybody else. We're all the same. That's it. I read those books just before I did this trip, actually, to like get myself in the zone. And I remember reading that bit and thinking like, is he just... I wondered how much truth was in it. So it was really interesting to see it actually in person and experience that directly.
And he talks as well about how kind people are. Like his kind of the message I get following him and reading all his books is just how around the world people are in general really kind. And if you go to a place, you realize that actually the people there are just like the people, where you live. And the world's populated with nice people, which is not a message we hear very often, but it's really nice to hear from people, and you have the same experience, that people are a lot nicer than, we think they might be.
Definitely. And I do think cycle touring selects for meeting a certain kind of people. So I think we are more likely to meet the people who are sort of open-minded and all this stuff. But I do think that even when you control for that, I think 95+% of people in the world are nice. And it's good to get a reminder of that yourself. And it's good to share stories that can remind other people as well. So if someone doesn't have the means or the interest in doing a tour like this, I think it's important that they can sort of get the lessons it teaches as well in a format they can enjoy. Like Alistair Humphrey's books are a perfect example of that.
Now, I think if I'm correct, you're working on a book about your experiences. Am I right?
Yeah. So since I got back 4 years ago now, I've been gradually sort of writing a book out of the journals I kept on the ride across, which has been probably more difficult than the ride itself in a lot of ways. But yeah, the plan is for that to be ready sometime this year. So watch this space. If
people want to, contact you or ask you a question or just follow you, are you on social media or do you have a website, or is there any way people can, just keep track of what you're doing? Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, and I've got my own website with my email address on it. People are free to drop me a line there. I love answering people's questions about cycling across Canada specifically, but cycle touring in general. So we'll put links to those URLs in the show notes. And Chris, thank you very much. It was really great to hear from you, and just to sense, it's not the journey, it's everything around the journey and the experiences you have on the bike. It sounds like a really meaningful journey, and it really came out in this discussion. So thanks for taking the time to share your experience with us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much for inviting me on. It's been great.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. If you liked it, why not give us a review? Better yet, subscribe and get inspired again and again. Also, if you want to find your own adventures, why not check out 10adventures.com, where you can use our free resources to plan your own trip or book a tour in over 60 countries and make your own epic memories on your next adventure.